The frost had not yet left the windows when her father spoke the words that sealed her fate. His voice was steady, though wearied by seasons of failed harvests, and in his tone she heard not cruelty, but desperation. The farm was slipping from their hands. The soil had given too little. Debts had grown too large. And so a bargain was struck. She was to be wed, not to the one her heart remembered, but to another, a man of means of cattle and stored grain, whose family could steady theirs through the lean winter. The arrangement was practical, even merciful in the eyes of her kin. Yet to her it was a chain fastened not with iron, but with silence. She bowed her head when they told her, though her chest burned, as if a spark had fallen inside. There were no protests, no tears, only the practiced quiet of a daughter trained to duty. Words would not change the truth. She pressed her lips together, sealing them as firmly as the pact itself. That night, while the fire whispered low and the wind pressed against the shutters, she lay awake. Shadows trembled across the rafters, shapes of branches bowing in the storm. In her palm, she held the smallest of keepsakes, a strip of ribbon frayed at the edges, once tied around her wrist by the man she truly loved. He had whispered then, long before this winter, that no snow or distance could keep him from her. She remembered the vow, though she no longer dared to speak it. Her heart beat against the walls of her silence like a bird caged in frost. She thought of him somewhere beyond the hills, perhaps forgetting her, perhaps remembering too well. But the world did not pause for longing. Her family's survival hung in the balance, and she was the coin that could pay the price. The following days passed in hushed preparation. Her mother mended her best dress, the one patched too many times to be new, but neat enough to present. Neighbors came and went, their voices carrying approval, relief, envy. She moved among them like a shadow, her face still, her hands busy with small tasks. Inside, her spirit dimmed like a lantern, burning low beneath its glass. She stood often at the window, watching snow gather along the fence rails. The land looked endless, merciless, yet in its distance she sought him. She wondered if he still rode the trails, if his hands still bore the smell of leather and pine. Did he sense the promise she carried within her, buried but unbroken? Or had time and hardship erased her name from his breath? She could not know. She only knew the silence of her own heart, heavy with duty, yet pierced by memory. When evening came, she sat by the hearth, hands folded, eyes fixed on the flames. Her family spoke of debts settled, of fields, saved, of cattle secured. She listened without reply. Each word was another stone upon her shoulders, yet she bore them without falter. To resist would be to abandon those she loved. Still as the fire dimmed, she pressed the ribbon to her lips, hidden from sight. It carried the faint scent of smoke and pine, the memory of a voice that had once promised to come for her. And though she spoke nothing aloud, a thought lingered, fragile, forbidden, but alive. Perhaps vows once spoken do not die so easily. The winter deepened, the snow thickened, and within her silence became both her burden and her prayer. The first true storm of the season swept across the valley like a hand erasing the horizon. Snow fell in sheets, cloaking the farm in silence, so deep it seemed to smother even thought. The fences vanished, the barn became a dim outline, and beyond the trees there was only a white abyss. The world shrank to the cabin walls, to the fire's breath, to the sound of wind dragging its cold fingers across the shutters. She rose before dawn each day, shoulders bent beneath the weight of chores that never ended. Water had to be drawn from the well, though ice fought her at every turn. The cattle had to be fed, their breath rising in clouds as they pressed against her with hunger. Her hands cracked from the cold, small wounds opening like tiny mouths against the pale of her skin. Yet she moved through it all without complaint, her silence once again her armor. Inside, her family whispered of the betrothal. The man she was promised to would come when the snow eased, they said. He would bring gifts, secure the papers, and take her hand before spring thawed the land. They spoke as though this were salvation itself. She nodded, eyes lowered, while her chest felt hollowed by each word. At night, she sat by the window watching the snow pile against the sill. The glass frosted over, blurring the distance into nothingness. Yet in her heart, she searched beyond it as though by sheer will she might pierce through storm and distance to find him, the one whose ribbon still lay hidden beneath her pillow. The storm outside mirrored the storm within. She thought of him often, but dared not speak his name. To do so would be to betray her family's trust, to dishonor the sacrifices they had made. And yet her silence ached. It was not the silence of obedience alone, but of longing forced underground, like a river trapped beneath ice, waiting for spring to break its chains. Her mother noticed the way she lingered at the window, the way her hands traced idle circles into the frost. "Do not let your mind wander too far," her mother whispered once. "Love will not feed us, land will." She lowered her gaze, nodding as expected. Though inside she thought, what is land without the breath to endure it? What is grain without the hand that holds yours steady in the storm? The snow pressed on. Each morning brought the same whiteness, unbroken, unyielding. Yet within her something fragile resisted despair. She carried the memory of his vow like an ember hidden in the fold of her dress. It did not warm her hands nor change her fate, but it kept her spirit from freezing entirely. And in the quiet hours when the wind howled loudest and the world outside seemed lost, she closed her eyes and whispered silently into her own chest, "If he remembers, he will come. If he remembers." The storm did not answer. Only the fire crackled, only the snow fell. Still she clung to the ember. The storm thinned for a time, leaving the world glazed in white, hard as glass beneath the pale sun. Paths were carved through the snow by boots and wagon wheels, not for wandering, but for purposed neighbors checking livestock, kinfolk trading what little could be spared. It was during this brief reprieve that her promised family came. They arrived with the sound of hooves breaking crusted snow, their wagon creaking beneath the weight of grain sacks and goods. Her father greeted them with a relief he tried to disguise, bowing his head as though before salvation itself. Her mother wiped her hands upon her apron and offered tea, her smile tight, the lines around her mouth deepened by winters too many. She stood behind them, hands clasped before her, the figure of a dutiful daughter. The men measured her with eyes sharp as scales in the market, appraising not her face but her frame, her health, the steadiness of her gaze. Their son, the one who was to be her husband, spoke little. His words clipped his tone, more suited to bargaining over cattle than to speaking with a bride. She lowered her eyes beneath their gaze, but inside a quiet rebellion stirred. Am I nothing more than land traded, a womb to secure a harvest? The thought shamed her, yet it also hardened her. If she was to be bound by duty, she would not let them take her dignity without resistance, even if that resistance lived only in silence. They brought gifts, a bolt of cloth coarse but warm, a knife with a wooden hilt, a measure of grain. Her family received each with gratitude, as though these tokens were the very breath that might keep them alive. And in truth, perhaps they were. She could not hate her kin for seeking survival, even if it came at the price of her own freedom. As the visitors spoke of arrangements of dates and dowries, her mind wandered. Beneath the table, her fingers toyed with the hem of her dress, brushing against the hidden ribbon stitched into its lining. Its frayed threads scratched her skin, a secret talisman against despair. She thought of him, not the man before her, but the one who had once tied that ribbon around her wrist and whispered of loyalty, stronger than winter. She could almost hear his voice, low and steady, carrying across the years. No storm, no distance, no promise will keep me from you. Her heart clenched, caught between memory and duty. She dared not look out the window, dared not hope for movement beyond the fields. Hope, she knew, could be crueler than resignation. When the guests departed, leaving the air heavy with unspoken contracts, she retreated to the barn under the guise of chores. The animals stirred softly, their breath rising in small clouds. She leaned against the stall, her hands pressed against her chest, her breath shaking. In the quiet of straw and wood, she allowed herself a single thought, spoken aloud, barely a whisper. If vows mean nothing, then what is left of us? Her words dissolved into the air, absorbed by the barn's timbers, unheard by all but the silent beasts. And yet the speaking of them gave her a measure of strength, not to defy openly, but to endure until whatever end awaited her. The snow began again that evening, fine as sifted flour. The world closed in once more, and she returned to her silence. Yet beneath that silence lay a secret. She was not empty soil. A vow had been planted within her, and though buried deep, it waited stubborn for its season to rise. The storm returned with a vengeance fiercer than before. Snow fell not in flakes but in veils thick enough to erase fences, barns, and roads, until the farm stood as an island adrift in white. The wind howled through the valley like a chorus of ghosts, bending the trees until their branches clawed at the sky. It rattled the shutters with such fury that sleep became a fragile thing, broken by every gust. She worked through the storm as one works through grief, without pause, without hope of finishing. Water had to be melted from ice, the animals had to be fed, even as their stalls grew damp with frost. Her fingers stung with cold until they bled, but she wrapped the wounds in cloth and carried on. The rhythm of labor steadied her, even as her spirit thinned like smoke and wind. Inside her, family grew more anxious with each passing day. Provisions dwindled, debts pressed louder in their silence. They spoke more often of the marriage, of how soon her betrothed might come to finalize the bond once the storm cleared. Their words weighed upon her like snow on a roof, each one threatening to break her beams. At night, she lay awake listening to the world outside, the endless roar, the shriek of wind finding every crack in the cabin walls. And beneath that, her own heart pounding against her silence. She thought of him again, the one she loved. Was he somewhere beyond this storm, trapped in his own cabin, perhaps forgetting her as she faded into the shape of another man's wife? Or did he remember the ribbon, the vow, the promise that no snow would keep him from her? Her doubts pressed close, yet in their midst, a stubborn flame still smoldered. She touched the hidden ribbon in her dress, frayed and worn, and whispered into the darkness, "You swore you would come, even through winter, even through storms." But the wind answered only with its hollow cry. On the third night of the blizzard, the world outside seemed to vanish entirely. Snow plastered the windows, sealing the house in a dim twilight, even at midday. Her father prayed over the dwindling food. Her mother stoked the fire with trembling hands. Obligation and survival bound them tight, yet Eliza felt bound by something deeper. A vow made not for grain or cattle, but for love. She pressed her forehead against the window pane, its cold biting into her skin, and searched the white void. There was nothing, only the storm, endless and merciless. Yet still beneath the roar of the blizzard, she thought she heard it, a whisper, not of wind, but of memory. No matter the weather, she closed her eyes and clung to that fragment, fragile as a flame in winter. The storm raged on, and somewhere within it, though unseen, a rider pressed forward, a man bent against the wind, holding fast to a vow that refused to die. For 3 days, the storm showed no mercy. The sky itself seemed to pour its fury into the valley, burying the land in drifts taller than fences, deeper than memory. Her family kept to the hearth, rationing bread, feeding the fire with wood meant to last until spring. Conversation shrank to whispers, each word heavy with hunger, each silence heavy with worry. Yet on the fourth day, the wind eased. The snow no longer hurled itself sideways, but drifted downward in weary flakes. The world emerged slowly, as though waking from a long and violent dream. Trees bowed beneath the weight of ice. The barn roof groaned. The fields were unrecognizable, blanketed in a white so pure it hurt the eyes. She stood at the window, breath fogging the glass eyes, straining over the distance. At first there was only stillness, an unbroken sea of snow. But then, faint almost imagined, she caught sight of a movement at the horizon. A dark speck shifting against the white, uncertain wavering. Her heart clenched, doubting her own sight. The speck grew larger, taking form. A horse. Its legs labored through the drifts, chest heaving steam into the air. Upon its back, a figure bent low, shoulders hunched against the cold cloak, stiff with frost. Each step seemed impossible, yet the rider pressed forward. Rushed forward, her breath caught, and the ribbon hidden at her breast burned against her skin. She pressed her palm over it, as if to steady her heart. Could it be him? Or was it simply a traveler lost, desperate for shelter? She dared not hope, yet hope surged all the same, rising against her silence, like a tide breaking through a dam. The horse staggered near foam, frozen at its mouth, its rider clinging tight, though nearly spent. When at last the figure lifted his head, she saw his eyes through the storm, weary, rimmed with frost, but alight with a purpose fierce enough to pierce the cold. Her hand flew to her lips. A tremor ran through her. It was him. Against every odds, through miles of snow and wind he had come. Not for land, not for grain, but for her. She stepped back from the window, her chest tight with disbelief and wonder. The storm had buried roads, silenced the valley, sealed her future in silence. Yet here he was, breaking through a covenant stronger than survival itself. Her family stirred at the sound of hooves crunching near the door. Her father frowned, her mother murmured prayers. But Eliza's heart was no longer bound in stillness. It leaped wild and unbidden, as if spring itself had entered the house ahead of its season. Outside, the rider dismounted, legs unsteady, cloak stiff with ice. He staggered toward the door, each step a vow fulfilled, each breath a defiance of death. And within her, the silence cracked. For the first time since her betrothal, a word rose unchained within her chest, not spoken aloud yet, but blazing mine. The door opened with a groan against the frost, and the wind spilled in before him. He stood there, framed in the dim light, a figure sculpted by snow and endurance. His cloak was stiff with ice, his hair matted to his brow, his face carved by cold. Yet in his eyes, even through exhaustion, burned something steady, unyielding, a vow carried across the storm. Her mother gasped softly, hand pressed to her chest. Her father's brow furrowed, the lines deepening with unease. They had expected suitors with gifts, not a man near broken by winter's fury. But Eliza's eyes saw only him. Not his raggedness, not his shivering frame, but the purpose that clung to him like a second skin. He spoke her name hoarse as if torn from his lungs. Just that her name, yet the sound broke the silence of months of contracts, of all the unspoken weight between them. She rose from her place by the hearth. For a moment her body did not move as she commanded. It trembled half with disbelief, half with the fear that if she reached for him, he would vanish like breath upon glass. But he did not vanish. He stood waiting, snow melting at his boots, his breath ragged, but his gaze steady. Her father broke the silence. "You've no right to stand here," he said, voice clipped, worn by worry. "She has promised. Our land depends upon it." The words fell heavy like iron laid across the table. Yet Eliza felt something inside her shift, the silence she had carried for so long, cracked under Mayrim's weight. She met her father's gaze, then turned back to the man before her. He did not answer the accusation with anger, nor with defense. Instead, he stepped forward, slow, deliberate, until the warmth of the fire touched his frozen skin. His hands, scarred and trembling, reached not for wealth or contract, but for the ribbon she still carried, hidden within her dress. He did not take it. He simply looked at her, and in his eyes she read the words he had once spoken. "No storm will keep me from you." Her breath caught. The silence she had wrapped around her heart split open, and a single word slipped from her lips, fragile yet radiant. Why his answer came not as argument, but as confession, each syllable broken but certain. "Because my vow was never to the land. It was to you." The fire crackled between them. Her father's face hardened, her mother's eyes filled with fear, but Eliza felt the room shift. She had been bartered like grain, measured like soil, bound by duty. Yet here in the dim cabin, a man stood nearly undone by winter, offering nothing but loyalty, not survival, not riches. Only love rooted deeper than snow. Tears long withheld pricked her eyes. She stepped closer, her hands trembling as she reached for his cloak, brushing away ice with fingers that could not stop shaking. His body leaned into her touch, not as possession, but as recognition that she was the reason he endured. The silence broke fully then, not with speeches, not with defiance, but with presence. He had come. She had answered. And the air between them, heavy with storm, softened with the warmth of a covenant no blizzard could bury. The cabin, already small, seemed to shrink with the weight of what had just been spoken. The fire snapped, casting shadows that flared across the walls, catching the sharp lines of her father's face. He rose from his chair slowly, his hands heavy with the gravity of a man who had carried fields on his shoulders, debts in his bones. "You think love feeds cattle," he said, voice thick as the logs stacked in the corner. "You think a vow warms the soil when spring comes. We cannot eat loyalty. We cannot plant hope in frozen ground." Eliza flinched at the words, not because they were cruel, but because they carried truth. She had known it all along. Survival was a hard currency, and her family's very breath depended upon her compliance. She had been the coin, the knowledge of it pressed against her like the storm's own wind. But then she looked at him, the rider, the man who had crossed the blizzard when even neighbors would not risk a mile. His cloak steamed near the fire, his boots still caked with ice, his body trembling with fatigue. Yet his eyes, dark and steady, did not waver. He had not come to barter or to argue. He had come to keep what he had vowed. She stood between them, her chest trembling with the pull of two worlds. To her left, her father, weary and desperate, tethered to the land that gave them life. To her right, the man whose loyalty had carried him through a storm that could have killed him. One offered survival, the other offered dignity. Her silence threatened to return to swallow her words as it always had. But something within her shifted, as if the ribbon pressed against her heart had become a flame. Her hands clenched, and at last she spoke, her voice unsteady, but her spirit unbending. "I am not soil to be traded." she said, her gaze moving to her father, tears stinging her eyes. I am not a harvest to be bartered for cattle and grain. I am your daughter, and my worth is not measured in what I can secure. I was born for more than silence. Her father's eyes narrowed, grief flickering behind the hardness. He opened his mouth, but her mother laid a hand upon his arm, her touch trembling. The mother's gaze lingered on Eliza, softer, almost mournful, yet carrying something close to recognition. The rider stepped forward, his voice low, reverent. I cannot offer land. I cannot offer gold. But I offer my hands, my strength, my life. What storm I brave to come here, I will brave again. Not for myself, for her. The room fell into stillness. The wind moaned outside, rattling the walls. But within the cabin, time seemed to pause. Her father looked from one to the other, his jaw tight, his shoulders bent beneath burdens both seen and unseen. Eliza felt the weight of the moment press into her chest. This was not victory, not rebellion. It was the unveiling of her soul. She trembled, but she did not step back. She stood with the rider, not against her family, but for herself. Silence stretched until even the fire seemed to hush. Then her father turned, lowered himself into his chair, and buried his face in his hands. He said nothing. He did not yield, nor did he curse. He simply sat, broken by a storm he had not expected. Not the snow outside, but the storm of love, refusing to be silenced. And for the first time, Eliza's silence was not her prison. It was her strength. The storm outside gathered itself again, brushing snow across the roof in sighs that seemed endless. Within, the fire burned steady, its glow, the only witness to what had shifted between them. Her father remained seated silent, his hands shadowing his face. Her mother moved softly, setting more wood on the hearth, as though tending flame might steady what words could not. Eliza stood near the rider, her breath shallow, her heart still trembling with the courage she had finally spoken aloud. He removed his cloak with clumsy fingers, the fabric stiff with frost, and laid it upon the floor. From its folds, he drew nothing, no coin, no contract, no token to tempt survival. Only his hands, scarred and raw from reins and rope, shaking from cold yet steady in their intent. He looked at her not with demand, not even with pleading, but with a reverence that stilled her breath. I cannot promise wealth, he said, voice roughened by the miles and the storm, nor land enough to ease the hunger of a farm. But what I vowed, once I vow again, now to walk beside you in snow, or in sun, in hunger, or in harvest, until my strength is spent, not to own, not to bind, but to remain. The words settled into the room like falling ash, quiet, unhurried, unshakable. Eliza felt them press into her chest, not like chains, but like roots, sinking into soil that had nearly forgotten how to receive. Her mother's eyes softened, wet with something unspoken. Perhaps she too remembered when vows were made, not for survival, but for love. Her father's silence held longer, heavier, yet he did not lift his head to interrupt. Eliza stepped forward. She took his hands in hers, feeling the tremor of his body, the bite of cold still in his skin. She did not speak immediately. Words seemed too small. Instead, she let her touch answer first, steady, willing, unashamed. At last she whispered, I have been promised to another in name, but my soul has long been promised to you. Tonight let it be sealed not by contract, but by covenant. The fire hissed softly, sparks rising as though to affirm her words. She glanced back at her parents, her voice gentler now, though no less firm. Forgive me. I know what you have borne, what you have feared. I know hunger makes bargains of daughters. But survival without love is not life. And if you lose me to duty, you will not save me. You will bury me. Her father's shoulders sank deeper, a sound like a sigh shuddering from him. He still gave no answer. Yet in his silence there was less steel, more grief, as though he knew she was right, though he could not bear the cost of admitting it. Eliza turned again to the rider. His eyes, weary yet unwavering, searched hers as though to be certain she would not falter. She did not. Together they knelt by the fire. No priest blessed them, no contract sealed their bond. But in the glow of the hearth, in the hush of winter's storm, their covenant was spoken not in grandeur, but in steadfastness, in the quiet recognition that love endured where even land and cattle might fail. Outside, the snow thickened again, blanketing the world in white. Yet inside the cabin, warmth grew not from flame alone, but from the vow that had survived the storm. The storm raged on, but within the cabin a new stillness took hold, not the silence of resignation, but of breath, shared of hearts steadying themselves in the nearness of covenant. The fire cast its soft glow upon them, painting their faces with light as fragile as dawn. The rider, still trembling from his journey, sat close to the hearth. Eliza laid a blanket across his shoulders, her hands lingering as though to assure herself he was real, not some vision conjured by longing. He looked at her with eyes half closed from exhaustion, yet within them flickered a gratitude fierce and wordless. Her mother moved gently about the room, setting bread upon the table. There was no festivity in the gesture, yet no bitterness either, only the quiet act of keeping bodies alive. Her father remained seated, gaze fixed upon the floor, his silence heavy but no longer immovable. He had not given consent nor spoken blessing, but neither had he driven the man back into the storm. For now, that was enough. Eliza tended to the rider's horse in the barn, the cold air biting her lungs. The animal shuddered, its flanks wet with sweat that froze into crystals. She rubbed it down with straw, whispering softly as if the horse might understand the depth of her thanks. Each stroke of her hand felt like an oath to care for what had carried him to her, to honor the suffering endured for love's sake. When she returned inside, the boy she once was, the girl bound by silence, measured in grain and cattle, seemed a ghost now fading into the shadows. In her place stood a woman who had chosen, who had spoken, who had been met with loyalty, that asked for nothing but her hand in return. That night, the three of them sat near the fire, her beloved, and the boy she had once been, or so it felt. The flames seemed to hum with their breathing. No grand declarations were made, no future carved in certainty. Yet she felt something being built among them, a home not of timber and soil alone, but of presence, of recognition, of dignity restored. Her beloved took her hand at last, his fingers rough scarred, still trembling from cold. She did not pull away. Instead, she folded her hand into his, their silence, no longer emptiness, but fullness, carrying the weight of what words could not express. Her mother, watching from the corner of the room, smiled faintly, a tired, wistful smile touched with the memory of her own youth. Even her father, though, still unmoved in his chair, let his eyes close for a moment, as though surrendering, however briefly, to a peace he could neither control nor deny. Eliza leaned closer to the fire, her hands still in his, and thought, this too is survival. This too is life, to be seen, to be cherished, to be chosen. The storm outside might bury fences and barns might weigh upon the roof until it groaned. But here before the fire, something had been kindled that no blizzard could smother. A home reborn, not perfect, not easy, but true. Morning came as a pale hush, so different from the fury that had ruled the nights. The wind was gone, the sky washed clean, as though the heavens themselves had tired of their rage. Snow so blanketed the valley, smooth and unbroken, glistening beneath a sun that had not been seen for weeks. Fences and fields were hidden, barns and sheds reduced to white mounds, yet the silence carried not fear but release. Eliza stepped outside the door, groaning behind her. The air was sharp, biting her lungs, but it tasted new, almost sweet. The world stretched out, pure and remade, as if inviting her to begin again. She drew the ribbon from her dress pocket, the frayed threads stiff with age, and held it against the wind. Once it had been a talisman of longing. Now it was proof of a vow endured. Behind her he emerged from the cabin, moving slower than before, but steadier, his body regaining its strength. The storm had battered him, but not broken him. He came to her side without words, his breath clouding the air between them. She turned, their eyes meeting, and in that gaze lay the whole of what had been endured, the silence, the waiting, the storm, the choice. Her father stood in the doorway, his figure heavy with weariness. He looked upon them, the rider who had brought nothing but his loyalty, the daughter who had defied the silence to claim her dignity, and for a long while he said nothing. Then, with a sigh that seemed to empty years of struggle from his chest, he stepped back, leaving the door wide as if granting space not only to them, but to the life that must now unfold. The boy she had been voiceless bartered, promised away, lingered in her memory for a breath, then dissolved like frost under morning light. In her place stood a woman whose worth was no longer bound to land or grain, but to love freely, given freely, endured. She took his hand. Together they stepped down into the snow, their boots sinking deep. Each step was heavy, but each carried them forward into a future still uncertain, yet true. The storm might rise again, debts might return, the soil might fail. But what they had built in silence and fire could not be undone. And as the sun climbed higher, she whispered to herself, a vow as quiet as prayer. Loyalty is stronger than survival. And love, real unyielding love, is the only harvest that endures. The wind stirred faintly, lifting her hair, carrying her words across the bright expanse. The blizzard had broken, and with it so had the chains of silence. The snow lingered for weeks, softening the edges of the valley, hiding the scars of earth beneath its clean white veil. To others, it was a season of hardship, of waiting for thaw. But within Eliza's heart, the snow had come to mean something different. The storm that once sought to bury her had instead revealed what could not be silenced. The farm still bore its debts. The cattle still strained against the thin stores of hay. Survival remained a daily burden. Yet the weight of obligation no longer crushed her. She was no longer the quiet coin bartered for grain, but the keeper of a vow that had endured through storm and silence. Nights by the fire carried a new stillness, not the suffocating hush of resignation, but the gentle peace of belonging. Her beloved's hands, scarred by rope and rains, found hers often not to claim, but to remind her, I came, and I will keep coming. In that touch, she discovered a dignity greater than land, greater than wealth, the dignity of being chosen, of being seen. Her father, though he did not speak of it, softened in small ways. He did not bless their union outright, but when her beloved lifted wood to the hearth or mended a broken fence post, the older man did not stop him. Survival, he seemed to realize, was not built on barter alone. It could also rest upon loyalty, upon hands willing to labor, not out of duty, but devotion. As winter loosened its grip and the first streams began to run again, Eliza stood at the threshold of the cabin, the ribbon in her hand. She no longer held it for memory, but as a token of promise fulfilled. The vow had not come gilded in wealth, nor sealed in parchment. It had come through snow, through storm, through the breaking of silence, and it had arrived at her hearth alive, steadfast, unbroken. Storms would come again. The earth would fail them at times, hunger would press close, grief might visit without warning. Yet she carried no fear. For in the blizzard she had learned this truth. Love rooted in covenant endures beyond season, beyond survival. And in that truth she found the strength to step into whatever lay ahead.